Welcome, everyone. This is the fifth event in our Interact Conversation series since we started with this series at the center, and it's actually the second one that we call Interact Downtown that is actually at this place here. The first one was with Kojo Koram a few weeks ago, and now we're lucky to have Jillian Schwedler here tonight, who I'm going to introduce to you in a minute. And this series is actually organized by the Interact Center for Interdisciplinary Peace and Conflict Research at FU Berlin, which some of you are familiar with, I guess. And the idea is of this series to bring, aspiring or inspiring new or old and experienced voices from within academia and these debates into the broader public and make it actually more accessible to people who maybe find it hard also to come to Dahlem to witness an event in the late afternoon during a hot weekday. So this is also why we do it here, not in Dahlem. So thanks to the aquarium here, again, for letting us use this venue. And also thanks to Miriam and Joy and the other colleagues at the Interact for their support in setting this up. To give you a short overview, how we'd like to proceed this evening is that I'm first going to give a short introduction to our speaker, then Jillian will give a talk that you've all been waiting for, and introduce you to some of the main ideas of her book. And then my colleague Miriam will be opening the discussion with some questions and remarks on the book, and then you will be able to pose your questions, remarks, comments, etc. And afterwards we'll have the occasion, to grab a drink, to have a chat. Please feel free to approach us. And you can also, of course, get a copy of this fascinating book. We have a book table prepared around the corner. This is the book that Miriam's holding up. We have a book table around the corner if you're interested in getting a copy yourself and, have it even signed by Jillian as a cherry on top. So this being said, it's a pleasure and actually an honor to introduce Jillian Schwedler to you. Jillian is a professor of political science at the City University, New York, at the Hunter College, and she's also a senior fellow at the Crown Center at Brandeis University. And furthermore, Jillian has contributed to shaping the fields of Middle East studies and political science as a member of the editorial committee for the Middle East Law and Governance Journal. She has been on the governing council of the American Political Science Association. Previously, she was on the board of directors of the MESA, the Middle East Studies Association, and of the board of the Middle East Research and Information Project, that some of you might be familiar through its Middle East Report publication. So over these different engagements, Jillian has managed, like few others, I think, to make use of what is a meticulous empirical analysis of Middle East politics for theory development and concept building in the broader discipline of political sciences. And her work is not only very broad in scope and very rich in depth, but it's also constantly moving the frontiers of contemporary debates. And over the years, Jillian has really mastered, I think, the art of bridging different disciplinary cleavages and weaving together these threads from political sciences, from the anthropologies, from urban and spatial studies, and the political sociology of protest, together into a range of what I believe are really thought-provoking and innovative, but still always quite accessible interventions, which are like just fun to read, and which have stimulated conceptual debates far beyond the boundaries of Middle East studies. And as regards the foci, the empirical foci of her work, Jillian's research agenda has evolved over the years from a focus on civil society and Islamist political parties, and research on the so-called inclusion-moderation hypothesis, to more research on contentious politics, protests, political geography, and research on urban space. And that's also why, for me personally, Jillian's work has become sort of like, like a trusted companion during my own researcher biography over the years. So when I was just studying before the Arab uprisings of 2011 and interested in the ways how the Brotherhood, the Islamist Muslim Brotherhood, and its conception of a civil state squared with like liberal conceptions of democracy and how its participation in elections was, influencing their political vision. So Jillian's first monograph, Faith and Moderation, was one of the go-to pieces of scholarship on Islamist political parties. And then when in 2010 to 2012, I was then engaged at SWP Berlin with the ways how policing and repression affected the popular uprisings. Then again, Jillian's work was there omnipresent and chiefly in the shape of her joint volume with Laleh Khalili on policing and prisoners in the Middle East. And more recently, again, Here, topical work on the microdynamics of the Arab Spring and the ways how you conceive of temporality and space and their relation during episodes of protest has been a huge inspiration to also our work at the Interact Center, both empirically and conceptually. And in fact, there's hardly a paper or project where I don't quote from your chapter in Jim Jaspers and Frederick Wolfe's book, or actually from this little piece that you wrote in the Poem series, Taking Time Seriously, Temporality and the Arab Uprisings. And there's actually also rarely a seminar where I don't assign one or more of your journal articles or also your recent co-edited volume, The Political Sciences of the Middle East, as a reading. And when I think of actually what you have in mind for future callings, I had to smile this morning because I was recently in Lita in Lebanon, and I got myself an air refreshener for my car in the shape of a little tree with a Hezbollah logo on it and a lighter of Hassan Nasrallah. And then I read that you were actually planning to study the politics of gift shops by militant groups, and I was like, I'm really very much looking forward to that. But anyway, we're here today to hear and discuss about your latest book, and which I think is a magnificent piece of work. And I must say I find it really fascinating that a book that is about Jordan has actually succeeded in gaining so much attention, which is often a country that is like, treated a bit on the fringes. But after having read it, I also understand why it has, and it's not only extremely well researched and beautifully written, but also provides an immense conceptual repertoire, and I guess a lot of us will be drawing on in the next years. And again, if you want to get a copy, take the chance today. And with that, I'd like to conclude this introduction, and I'll give the floor to you, Jillian. I very much look forward to hearing what you have to say and your thoughts about the background of this book. And again, it's an honor and pleasure to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Wow, thank you so much for that incredible introduction. Thank you for the invitation to be here, and thank you for Miriam for being my discussant, and thank all you guys for coming out on this absolutely gorgeous night when you might be out having a beer already, so it'll be there on the other side of the talk, so thank you. Yeah, so this book I've been working on for a very long time, and I just want to start with one anecdote that is in the book, but is sort of important when we're thinking about how we're conceptualizing projects and our own writing projects. And I was taught, as we're all taught when you're doing interviews, after you're done doing the interview, you say, am I asking the right questions? What else should I be looking at? Closer? Okay. Great. Thank you. Am I asking the right questions? And I was interviewing an activist in Jordan about the public gathering law that changes over the years. And after this long discussion, and I'm scribbling notes, I'm like, am I asking the right questions? What am I looking at? What should I be looking at? And he's like, yeah, Jillian, nobody cares about the public gathering law. Like, it just doesn't shape what we do. And I was like, oh, so what should I be looking at? And he said, well, one thing is that the places to protest are disappearing. And I thought, like, what does that mean? How do places disappear? And it sent me down this whole different track. And so it's just really listening to your interlocutors is really important. And the second anecdote I want to start with, which connects to that, was a different person. I had given a bunch of political science works on Jordan too, and he read them, and next time I saw him, I was like, so what do you think? And he said, it's good. You guys are right. This is my work as well as others. But he's like, I just don't recognize Jordan. And that was like devastating. It's like you're talking about parliaments and elections, and like that's a sideshow to us. That's not what's really happening. And so this book is an effort to address both of those, to do something new, to bring out a lot of work on Jordan and what's happening in Jordan. But also I wanted to write something that would be recognizable to Jordanians, even if they disagree with my analysis, but they would go, oh yeah, that's going on. So that's kind of the background for what I have here. My starting question is, like, what can we learn from protests outside of the conventional framework? So the conventional frameworks for protest are either social movement studies, which I love, I'm not against social movement studies, but in those cases we tend to look at the movement, and then protests are something the movement does along the way. The other big approach to protest is these large event data sets that you analyze, and I'm not against those either. I think they can be super insightful. But I've discovered sometimes they can get some things wrong, and I'm going to point out a few of those things. So I'm looking at protests from the 19th century to the present, looking at protests, where they exist in space, and how those spaces change, and how protests change space, and how protests changes politics, and a bunch of questions, but I try to sort of loop them together. And so I'm going to give you I'm going to introduce the main ideas of the books and then give you three pieces to illustrate that hopefully will tie together and give you a sense of what I'm doing. So Jordan ends up being this fascinating case. It's a non-democratic country that has hundreds and hundreds and sometimes thousands of protests every year. And it reminded me of going to a protest, reminded me of being in Washington, D.C., and perhaps here, where you walk by a protest and you're like, oh, what's that about? And if you have time, you stop, otherwise you go on. Or protests are annoying because they cause traffic jams, and it's a frustration because now you have to drive somewhere different. But this is a non-democratic country, right, that has hundreds of protests, but no massacres. The last massacre was done by the British in 1923. And so people aren't afraid of the riot police in an interesting kind of way. No one expects anyone to fire into the crowds. And so these were some of the animating questions about why I thought this case was interesting to look at. So this is the cover of the book, which I just want to talk about for a second because it really illustrates the spatial dynamics I'm looking at. So this is from a set of protests by Nidal El-Khairi. The protests he's drawing about are in May and June of 1918. And they start off as anti-tax law reform protests, and then they become anti-austerity protests. And they take place all across Jordan. There's tens of thousands of people all over the country, in every part of the country protesting. It's illegal to criticize the king in Jordan. And so very often people criticize the prime minister as a proxy. And the office of the prime ministry is located at the 4th traffic circle on a particular street. It's called the 4th Circle. So this is representing, this guy in the middle is a member of the riot police, or the gendarmerie, or in Arabic, Quwat al-Darak. What it says on the bottom here is cute Darak, cute as in English. So instead of the Darak forces, it's saying the cute Darak at the 4th Circle, means the office of the prime ministry. And what this means is the gendarmerie is really well behaved, where there's thousands of people at the office of the prime ministry protesting. They don't do anything to the protesters. This little boy is hugging him, there's hearts. This officer here is actually holding up a selfie stick to take a picture, right? So the protests become like a photo op, something that the regime isn't afraid of. Of course, the regime doesn't want them there. But because there's all these journalists there, they do their best to turn it into a photo op of look how moderate Jordan is. We don't repress our protesters. And in fact, the crown prince goes there and in front of all the cameras and thanks the head of the gendarmerie for protecting Jordanians' rights to protest and express their dissent. Meanwhile, the left part of this picture here is you can see another member of the gendarmerie raising a billy club and rocks being thrown and buildings on fire. This neighborhood, which is Hayat Tefele, is about 1 kilometer away. So here's the thing that the large data sets get wrong. In one location, thousands and thousands of people are protesting peacefully and the riot police allow them to protest. And a short distance away, a small number of protesters are getting their heads beat in, a police station is on fire, and there's wild violence for 50 people that aren't visible to anybody. And so this sort of captures some of the puzzles that I'm trying to get at, is like how do we think about why repression in one place and not another place? And so these are the 5 core questions in the book. I'm not going to talk about all of them today, but what role do protests play in challenging state power, but also reproducing state power? I'll talk about what that means in a minute. Why do protests emerge where they do and take the form they do? And why does repression take different forms? Why do thousands of people left here undisturbed and 50 people over here saying the same thing on the same day are treated with greater violence? What are the political effects of routine protests? So by these I mean, and I'll talk about some of these, protests where people show up in the same place every week. It's almost choreographed. You go here, we go there, the police line up there, and after 2 hours we go home. And nobody thinks they're actually going to achieve the goals they're demanding. So what is the point? Like, why are you doing this? And then finally, and I'm not going to talk about this today because of time, but the book really tries to take Jordan not as a, contained entity, but situated in regional and international politics, having to do with protests as well as security, financial interactions, et cetera. I'll give a few examples, but mostly I'm going to talk about the earlier issues. So those are the key questions. I define protest basically as people gathering in space to make a claim against some authority, often the state, but not only a state. It could be a local tribal leader or another family. This isn't the best definition for all uses of protest because we have the literatures on weapons of the weak and everyday forms of protests, and that's all fascinating and wonderful, and it's just not what I'm interested in for this particular book. So gathering in space allows me, and I start in the 19th century, to include things like raids against Ottoman infrastructure, railways, sabotage, setting garrisons on fire, blocking roads to block trade. And what's interesting by taking this 150-year view is the places that did that in the 19th century still do that today. They still block roads, they still burn down police stations, and they talk about it. And there's elaborate poems about it, and it exists in personal memoirs. So people have memories of, we're kind of badass. We've been revolting for 150 years, and nobody's going to stop us. So I include those, but also then our conventional forms of protests, of sit-ins and strikes and marches, et cetera. So it's this broad view of protest. And I mentioned that Jordan has hundreds of protests, so it's actually a good case to look at patterns of protest. You need a lot to have patterns emerge. But the fact that there's not violence doesn't mean the police is happy or the government is happy with all of these. And I'll show you the ways in which they're trying to shut down protests. But this image in particular was at a protest of about 50 people, and there's about 300 security forces, and one axis, say you guys are the protesters, you can come and go here, and they're lined up on all three other sides. But you can come and go freely, it's completely fine. But I like this photo because it shows 4 different security agencies in 4 different uniforms lined up in a row all around. So you see there's this heavy presence, and what you don't see here are a lot of the secret police people who stand around with their phones and photograph or videotape everything and turn that in. So there's no anonymity in crowds anymore. So my 3 main interventions, one is that protests are integral to state-making processes and state-maintaining processes, right? They're not once in a while ruptures to normal time politics. They're actually part and parcel of ongoing politics, and states are constantly scrambling to respond to where these where pressures are coming from. This isn't entirely new insight. It is not. It exists in all kinds of Marxist theories and anthropological approaches to the state, et cetera. But it's often in places like Jordan, the state making is told like this. After the Great Arab Revolt in World War I, the British and French divided up the region, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the British put the Hashemites in power in Jordan and Iraq. Yes, there were some protests and resistance to them, but they basically crushed them, and then the states were established. End of story. And that completely, I mean, it's superficial. I think it completely misunderstands what happens. And the book talks about dozens, frankly, of examples, but to give just a couple, and I'll give you a third in a minute, I argue that the protests actually profoundly shape the state in ways that continue to be evident today. So, for example, a protest that took place this coming September, 100 years ago, September of 1923, was this prominent tribe, the Adwan tribe, was kind of frustrated with this emerging new government because they were hiring Syrians and people from other tribes, and they're like, you know, why aren't you hiring from our tribe? We should be getting a bigger piece of this too. So they have this huge protest downtown, and they ride through town on horses and make their demands, and the next day they're coming back into town, and the British Royal Air Force flies over and bombs them, shoots them down, and dozens are killed, which is way extreme reaction to what I've seen are legitimate claims from a local power holder in the area to ask for these things. So this emerging emir scrambles and negotiates with them, and up until today, the Adwan tribe is one of the closest tribal confederations to the monarchy in terms of jobs, in terms of prestige, et cetera. And that only happened after this instance of protest. To give a second example that's still evident today is these Bedouin raids. I showed you a picture of destroying the railroad. The Bedouins used to carry pilgrims and trade north and south, and so when they built the railroad, they didn't need the Bedouin to do that. So they just kept destroying the railroad and raiding, having raids, and basically they were a thorn in the side of this regime that was trying to establish control, and they completely couldn't establish control. And so what they did finally was to go to the Bedouin and hire them to protect the railroad, right? So, okay, you guys are troublemakers, we'll hire you to protect us, and we'll pay you and give you jobs in that way. And up until today, Bedouin are overrepresented in the security services, in a continuing instance. And all of these are because of protests that happened early on. So I have a lot of instances, and I'll show you one more in a minute, but ways in which these protests, have long-term impacts on state making and state maintaining. So that's one of the first interventions. The second one I'm going to show you in a minute, so I'll only talk about it briefly, is how protests shape and are shaped by the built environment. So we know protests are shaped by the built environment. You can't gather thousands of people if you don't have a place where thousands of people can gather. You can't be disruptive if you don't have access to certain kinds of places. But what I show is actually the built environment is also shaped in response to protests. Governments do things to the built environment after protest to try to prevent people from being as disruptive in the future. And the last is just this sort of regional and global entanglements and processes and vice versa. So I'll say a little bit about that later, but not as much, just for time. I try to do a lot in the book, so it's hard to narrow it down to a talk. Okay, this is my third example of the state making, how protest shaped state making in ways that are evident today. So this is what becomes the state of Jordan, and after, well, before and during and after World War I. It's really this sort of north-south corridor. It's not that the largest town is 2,000 people, it's Salt. You have Damascus to the north, Jerusalem, Baghdad, even Mecca and Medina to the south. So Jordan's just kind of this transity place. So you have all these little towns that have really strong local identities. The people in the north largely identify as the southern part of Greater Syria. People in the south, some yes, some no, but they have strong independent identities. But in terms of what this area is, all the power is in those north-south towns. Now, when the emir, he's not emir yet, but when he comes with the British support to establish his control, he camps in the south, and after a couple months, he has to decide where he's going to settle and create his new capital. And he decides he's going to create the capital in Salt, which is the largest town near the north. And he goes up there with his entourage and the British to the north, and the Saltis don't want him. They are protesting in the streets for days. They don't want him there because they have their own local authority structure. They're like, go somewhere else. This is our area. So another sheikh from the Bani Sakhr says, hey, I've got this little town called Amman. Nobody's there. There's some traders and Circassians and Chechen refugees, from the Ottoman period. So nobody's going to give you any grief. Why don't you settle there? And he does. So Amman becomes the capital, the economic, political center of the country. Now more than half the population lives in Greater Amman because in Salt they protested and wouldn't let him settle there. And it's funny today when you talk to some Saltis, they're like, oh, that was a bad move on our part. We maybe should have let him settle in Salt. Here's Amman, and as soon as it becomes this sort of the new capital, it becomes a site for protest because you go, as people do in many protests, you go to the site of grievances, you go to embassies, you go to government officials. And so since all the new offices are in downtown Amman, people start converging on Amman. There's a mosque there called the Grand Husseini Mosque, and people gather there. It has nothing to do with Islam. It just has a big plaza in the front of it. And so people gather there, protest, march to the municipal offices, protest there, and go home. So this becomes a routine in this particular space. Meet here, march there, have speeches, and go home. That continues up until today. This is an aerial view of the mosque. The streets have been widened, but now this is where you see thousands and thousands of people meet at the Grand Husseini Mosque, march to the municipal center. The municipal center is in a different place. They moved it, but it's still downtown. Give speeches and go home. And as long as you do that, and it takes 3 to 4 hours total, no one will bother you. The government won't bother you. They'll be down there watching. The police will be down there, the riot police, but nobody will interfere. This is one of the protests downtown organized by the Muslim Brotherhood. And you can see the Muslim Brotherhood has their own parade guards to make sure nothing goes wrong. So these are protests that aren't intended to actually be disruptive, more sort of demonstrations of sort of people and make claims. Store owners don't close. Nobody's worried anything's going to happen. Nothing gets boarded up. And so that begs this question, are these protests even visible or disruptive to anyone? And you say, how can thousands of people not be visible? Well, part of the answer is the government offices have moved out of downtown Amman. The main commercial offices, the big companies have moved out of downtown Amman. Now you have backpackers, people going to see the Roman ruins, Iraqi refugees, low-end electronics stores, appliance repair. You can get any appliance repaired down there. They're masters of repairing used things, used clothing. But it's a low-end place. And if you're not downtown, you're not even aware that these are there. And this is one of the ways that I mentioned these events data sets, would see downtown protests and go, look, a spike in protests, thousands of people are showing up. But these aren't contentious at all. Right? And so I think we need to sort of not just think that more people showing up means it's more contentious. And I'll come back to these in a second. So as the city has expanded, it's expanded in all directions. This is a project in West Amman, the west side, which is where the high-end retail and government offices and hotels are all located, with sushi bars and all that stuff are located. And this is called Abdali Boulevard. And they cleared an entire middle-class neighborhood to build this project. Many people protested. They didn't want to move, but they were all eventually cleared. They moved a transportation hub where people do shared taxis and low-end taxis. They moved that out of the way because if you're going to have this beautiful gleaming project, the last thing you want are like working-class people taking shared transportation. So this whole thing has changed for having this new gleaming downtown Amman, because the actual downtown Amman isn't pretty or gleaming or modern at all. And so these become sites of tremendous resentment and opposition. This is a picture that I took as they were building it. It gives you a sense what they're going for. You have a not modestly dressed woman, I think spraying cologne on herself with a handbag, tossing her hair. There's a wallet in there. And what says exclusivity more than the red velvet rope, right, and the paparazzi. So official numbers for unemployment in Jordan are 25%. Official numbers. 25 and under, 40%, and those are official numbers, which we know are too low. It's in a terrible economic situation. There's not enough water. Most people don't get water more than once a week, sometimes once every 2 or 3 weeks. Houses are falling in. There's not enough teachers for many of the schools, even though the education system is better than in many other parts of the world. So when the money gets poured into these projects, people are really resentful. I found a subsequent to the book being published, but I didn't get permission to use it, a photograph of a pile of bathtubs going into a high-end hotel. And people see these piles of bathtubs, like, why are there bathtubs that you're going to fill with water going into a hotel when we don't have enough water? We don't have any water, right? And so there's tremendous resentment. And so there's tons of protests around these kinds of projects. Here's one that starts in Aqaba, where these unemployed workers want jobs and they're not getting any attention, so they decide they're going to march to Amman right past these gleaming projects downtown and demand jobs, and they do. It starts about 40 people, it ends up about 350 when they get there. They march past Abdali Boulevard, they go to the downtown, and they make their claims not to the government herself, but to the monarchy, to the royal court. And they're there for 3 weeks. They get offered some jobs after about a week. And they're like, we don't want those crappy jobs. We want jobs with pensions and health care and paid vacations. They wanted jobs in the private sector for these industries that had been privatized. So think about that. The monarch they end up getting these jobs. They get jobs and they send them home. They come up with 350 really desirable jobs in the private sector to get these guys to go home. Why don't you just, break up this, crush this and send them home? Part of the answer is because these are people coming from those old towns that made those agreements with the monarchy eventually that will support you, but you have to do stuff for us. You get us jobs. How come you're not hiring Syrians? We want to have these jobs. And they still feel they're still owed that. And so the government can't simply violently repress this group of people, because then you're going to have those whole families, whole extended units, just outraged and an even bigger problem. So when they get jobs, then this continues. This is the one that I took a photograph. I missed this by 1 day, but the banner was still up. This was people from Deban, a very impoverished agricultural district, who left their banner up after they got jobs. And these aren't covered in the media. They're not covered anywhere. You have to see them. The big one, first one I showed you, was covered in the media. But after that, none of these are covered in the media. And so I fortunately have colleagues and friends that keep an eye out for them, and will take pictures and let me know when they're happening. But it became this new repertoire of ways to get jobs, is to march to the capital and make these demands. People from those old north-south towns, which are now peripheral, right? Amman's the capital. They used to be in that important area. Now they're very peripheral to the economic and political center. And the last way in which their protests and resistance has changed, not the last way, another way in which it's changed the political system is as they're making these demands and creating so many problems, the government's like, okay, don't worry, we'll give you more representation in parliament. So they gerrymander the system. So in those areas, you'll have sometimes one seat in parliament for every 3,000 people, whereas in Amman, it'll be one seat for every 30 or 40,000 people, right? And that's a result of all the grievance and expressive dissent in these areas that the government feels it has to constantly respond to. Okay, so that's the first one. This is the fun one. I mean, I think they're all fun, but it's my book, so. Space in the built environment. So I have this typology of ways in which governments change the built environment in response to protest. But instead of defining these, I'm just going to show you them in turn because it's much more evocative to see the illustration. This is, so erasures. Erasures is the idea that governments want to get rid of any evidence that there was resistance, particularly large resistance. So any banners have to go, placards, everything has to be erased. So this is from Bahrain in spring 2011. Massive uprising. It's called the Pearl Revolution because it was focused not only there, but it was focal point, like Tahrir, people protested elsewhere in Egypt. Here they protested elsewhere in Bahrain, but the Pearl Roundabout became the center of the protest. And that symbol became the center of protest. So after they crushed the protest, the government decided to get rid of that roundabout entirely. So they deconstruct the statue. The roundabout becomes a perpendicular intersection. But that's not enough. This coin is taken out of circulation. They mint a new coin because this coin has the Pearl Roundabout on it. Right? That's how contentious they thought it was, like how extreme they were willing to go to erase every evidence. Obviously, things like these beautiful artwork in Tahrir, which the artist documented and expected to be destroyed. But the government, imagine you could have left it there so that for years anyone could go and witness all this beautiful art that was created from the revolution. Instead, it's all erased. It all has to be erased. And usually when things are erased, you put something in its place like a statue to the military, a statue to the army, a really, really big flag, something really nationalist goes up in its place. So that's erasures, right? So you see the government is changing the built environment to eliminate these evidence or memories. You don't want to remind people that they're, revolutions. Exposures are ways in which the environment is opened up to facilitate securitization and policing. So on the right is Haussmann's Paris, which famously was reconstructed after many waves of revolts and uprisings, and of course we know it didn't stop it. Those wide boulevards accomplished many things, some of them like putting in sewage lines and creating better airflow and traffic, et cetera. But they also, the geographer David Harvey shows that each of those wide boulevards ends outside of the city at an army barracks. And so these become ways that you can move troops really rapidly in the city if you need to, because those Parisians just won't stop protesting. On the left is Tahrir, and this is interesting because Tahrir was literally built in emulation of Paris. The Khedive Ismail went to Paris, loved it, and was like, I want one, and goes home and builds one. And so Tahrir, it's not called Tahrir at that point, it takes the name in the 20th century. It's simultaneously the most easily policed space in Cairo because of those wide boulevards that don't exist elsewhere, because of those bridges that are designed to carry heavy weaponry, right? It's an easily policed space, but it also created a space where 100,000 people could gather that also did not exist before. So this is to illustrate that these can go both ways. These big open spaces and military spaces can also work for protest. So we want to sort of think about each individual case rather than assuming wide boulevards mean better policing. Wide boulevards can also create other kinds of opportunities. Has anyone seen the film Hurt Locker? It's kind of an older film. I see all old people up front nodding. The opening scene, it was about diffusing bombs in Iraq. And the Hurt Locker is that suit that guy's wearing because you're diffusing a bomb that could blow up and you hope that it's going to save your life. This was filmed in Sumaya Street in Wahdat, which is a refugee camp in Amman, that never had a big wide street like this. It had very narrow streets when it was built as a refugee camp. And then in the 60s, late 60s and 70s, Jordan has this conflict between the army and the Palestinian Fedayeen, the guerrilla Palestinian resistance movement, that finds strongholds in the Palestinian refugee camp, and the Jordanian government and army discover they can't get into the camp easily because these streets are so narrow. And so after that's done, we just create big wide streets in the middle of camps so we can get in. And now the police station outside of Sumaya Street, in the northern part of Sumaya Street, looks more like a prison sentry tower than it does a police station. It's like you look down into the camp, so for this kind of surveillance. In Ferguson, Missouri, this was after Michael Brown was killed. He was the person who was murdered by the police that started the Black Lives Matter movement. After these months and months of protests in the area, which were also violently put down, we don't know if it was the police, the municipality, but hundreds of trees were cut down in and around homes around the park. And the police would then drive around at night with search spotlights for security purposes that would shine into people's homes because now these trees were cut down in front of them. So it's this extraordinary act of violence exposing people's houses, all in the name of security. And this happened because of the protests. So you see, on my list of things to follow up on is Cairo University had a bunch of trees cut down around it for similar purposes. So I'm looking into that also. Containment. Containment is the idea that you create spaces where people can protest, but nobody can see it, right? It's contained. So this is the University of Jordan. It wasn't created for this purpose, but I'll give you one that was. It's like a fortress. It has few entrance and egrets with turnstiles that are kind of chokeholds. You can protest on the campus all you want. They will not try to stop you or disperse you, with very few exceptions. Just don't try to take it out on the street and march anywhere else. And so when protests conclude, they'll let a few people leave at a time, but they won't let anyone else leave until those people really do disperse, right? So you can protest, just be contained. There's another university, well, there's many universities in Jordan. There's one in Irbid, which is the biggest town north. It's the second biggest town, north of Amman, the capital, and it's called Yarmouk University. And in the 80s, there were protests at Yarmouk University that ended violently. 11 students were killed. They happened in 2 waves. And most of the protesters were more leftist-leaning, but they were from like doctors, lawyers, engineers, these kind of professional schools, the technical schools. And so in the late 80s, after the second round of protests, the government built a brand new campus for the technology programs, and they called it JUST, the Jordan University of Science and Technology. Brand new campus. And it's located in the middle of the desert. So instead of being an urban campus in the middle of the city where everyone can see, now if you protest, you're on the campus, but you're way out in the desert and nobody's going to see. So it renders you less and less disruptive. Exclusions are ways in which people simply excluded from places you might protest. This again is the Abdali project that I showed you that artist rendering of. I wish I had it from the opposite angle, but on this far end up here is a big plaza with landscaping where people can gather and hang out, and there's benches, and it's a big open, beautiful public space. And it doesn't exist in real life. And architect and urban planner Eliana Abu Hamdi was talking to some of the organizers and saw this model and said, where's the plaza? What is that? There's no plaza there. When are you going to build the plaza? And they said, we were asked not to build the plaza because they were worried people would protest there. And this is our new shiny mega project. We don't want political protests there. So they simply didn't build the plaza. This is the 4th circle, traffic circle. The prime minister is behind me because you don't take a picture of the prime minister. You don't take a picture of government buildings. That will get you arrested. You'll see in a minute, you can take pictures of riot police. Nobody cares. But this traffic circle was a place where people would gather and protest all the time, that middle plaza. And after, around 2013, 2014, they put up a fence around it and landscaped it and removed all the benches, and so you simply can't access it. It's simply this landscaping, so you can't gather there anymore. Likewise, the inset, this was a place of gathering. Thousands of people would gather there, and it is also fenced off and landscaped. So there are ways of taking away the spaces of where, this is the comment, our protest spaces are disappearing. You're taking away the spaces where people would protest, so they can't gather there anymore. This is at the traffic circle. This, an architect showed me this, that this is one of the underpasses. And this underpass, to move traffic quickly through the circle, this underpass is designed, as many are, to be able to carry heavy weaponry. So it's wide enough and subtle enough of a turn that if you need to move armored vehicles in and around the city quickly, all of this new infrastructure can handle that. That picture I showed you, the drawing, right, of that huge, with the cute riot police, the cute Darak. This is one of the protests happening during that time. And the traffic circle was completely jammed. You saw the traffic circle, but only, 1,000 people falling down in all directions could get there. And so one of the streets, you came down the street, down the hill, there's this huge parking lot by the Jordan Hospital, and people began to protest there because it was the largest gathering space in proximity of the Fourth Circle to actually gather and protest. So thousands of people could gather there. And here they are at that protest gathering. But the government decided that was also a little, they decided this was, I'm getting ahead of myself, that this was now, you could protest there, but they wouldn't let you protest at the Fourth Circle anymore. And so there's a protest in the spring of 2019. There's a Facebook page for most protests, and it's like, Fourth Circle protest, 6 o'clock, I call my friends, we're gonna meet there. 5:45, I'm at the Fourth Circle, and there's all these riot police and armored vehicles, and there's nobody else. And so I finally call my friend, and I'm like, where are you? And he's like, we're at the Fourth Circle. I'm like, no, you're not. Like, I'm at the Fourth Circle, and no one's here. And he said, the Fourth Circle isn't the Fourth Circle anymore. It's this parking lot. So they kept the name, because the name is contentious, but it's not even at the Fourth Circle anymore. So this is the new Fourth Circle. And here's a smaller gathering at it, where you can see now, because there's this pedestrian bridge, the police can literally stand and look down, and you're surrounded by police at these protests. But even these become too contentious sometimes. Here's a protest that's Ma'anash. These were people, Ma'anash, we have nothing. People from those towns, those old East Bank towns outside of the capital, who come to the capital to protest in the parking lot. And after several weeks, they decided they didn't even want that to happen. And we're talking like 100 protesters now, not that one before with thousands. We're talking a small group. And this is one street approaching that parking lot, and you can see way outnumber. So they just decided we don't want protests there anymore. And this is what the parking lot looks like today. There's a 10-foot concrete fence around the parking lot. You can get into the parking lot, cars get in, you have access to it. But this fence or this wall serves absolutely no purpose except that nobody can see anything happening in the parking lot. So it makes it a stupid place to protest because nobody can see you. So nobody protests there anymore. And this is, in fact, one of the techniques. You've seen these fencing off spaces, walls going up all over the city, except that downtown area. They're happy with you protesting downtown because you're not disruptive and you're not visible to anybody unless you're down there. This is Hashimite Plaza. This is where the unemployed workers came and camped out until they got jobs. This is now not open 24 hours a day. This is open only certain times during the day and has these turnstiles. I mean, yes, you can jump these fences, but it's legally rendered closed in the evening. I don't actually get the design of this turnstile because you can really just walk through. I don't know why the turnstile's actually there, but you get the idea that it's a turnstile. So those are my sort of illustrations of the ways in which protests have shaped, the city and shaped the built environment, and the government's constantly moving around trying to shut them down. So the last one, my last illustration, is this question of routine protest. Why bother organizing protests that you're not going to get what you're asking for? The one I'm showing you, they're asking for the cancellation of the peace treaty with Israel. Not going to happen. You're protesting in the same way, week after week. We meet here, the riot police meet there, we move here, it lasts 3 hours, and everybody goes home. Like, it's not even contentious. Like, why? What's the point? And so I was taught by somebody that whenever something seems so ridiculous, like, why even do that? That you should make it a real question, like, okay, well, why do that? Don't just be befuddled and dismissive. Say, like, why are they doing that? And so that was what I did. Like, why are they doing this? And I said, what are the political effects of routine protests? The effects that the protests have that might have nothing to do with accomplishing what they're setting out to do, but they're doing other things. So I went to a bunch of these protests in the same location many weeks in a row, and I'd get there really early. So I took all of these photos. I didn't take all the photos in the slideshow, the other ones I had permission for, but I took all of these photos, which will become important in a moment. So I show up early, and here's the Kaluti Mosque. This, again, is just a landmark, nothing to do with Islam. People aren't pouring out of the mosque after Friday prayer in fits of Islamic rage or anything like that. It's just a gathering point where there's a nice plaza. And so the TV crew is sitting there early waiting for something to happen. The police are there early. Nobody's there yet. There's no protesters here when I take this photo. The riot police have their shields, but they're just kind of hanging off on the side. There's a big field where they gather, thousands of people can gather there. And on the far side of the field, here's these 18, you can't really see from this picture, but there's 18 armored vehicles, just waiting. Here the protesters are gathering, and there's probably 50 or 60 on this particular day, and they include people from across the political spectrum. And so one of my first answers to what are the political effects of protests, like what are protests doing, if not accomplishing their goal, is illustrated in this picture. So you see all these green flags are flags of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood shows up, they pass out their flags, they have a photographer that takes a ton of pictures, and then they go home. And then the next day in the Islamic newspaper, it's like, the Muslim Brotherhood is so contentious, demanding the end of the peace treaty, challenging the government, et cetera, et cetera. But they just go and get the photo ops and leave. They never confront the police. They disappear. And so one of the things the Muslim Brotherhood is doing is it's staging something for its constituencies to look like it's contentious and politically challenging, but it's really not. Remember the picture of the parade guards? They don't want anything to go wrong in their protests. They want those aerial photographs with thousands of people and the the Muslim Brotherhood flags. Like, looks like craziness, but they're not contentious, right? But they use it for that particular purpose. Here, the riot police are beginning to line up. Now, normally, in democratic, but particularly non-democratic countries, you don't go walk up to the riot police and take a bunch of photographs of them. But nobody cares. Here I am moving in and out of the protest. You can see tons of photographers just standing there waiting for something to happen. This is a march on the Israeli embassy from the picture on the left. They're clearly not marching on the Israeli embassy. They're performing like they're going to march on the Israeli embassy, and they're going to confront the police. But they're not really trying to march on the Israeli embassy. And here's the road, the path to the Israeli embassy, and you can see the riot police lining up in the middle of the road from a distance. But we keep the sidewalks open because we don't actually want to inconvenience pedestrians or anyone else that lives in the neighborhood, right? So there's clearly no expectation that they're really trying to get past the riot police, because you can get past them really easy if you just walk by. So it's this a kind of a theater, you know, a contentious protest repression theater in a sense. Here I am behind the riot police. You know, you could just go in the crowd, out of the crowd. Here I'm just circling around. Here I am right up in the front confronting the riot police with the women. It's very common to put women up front when there's photographers present. This is not a Jordan or Middle East thing. This is a global thing in protest because you're daring to have photos of people beating women because it carries more symbolic weight in ways we shouldn't, but you know, activists know that we can make it look bad. So here I'm right in the front. And on this day, these photos were from one day in 2009. On this day, 2 vans of these guys showed up who are plain-clothed somebodies. Now, often in protesters, you have like actual loyalists that are plainclothes, you know, civilians that come and defend the state, and this happens everywhere. You find these kind of loyalists that show up, the kind of thugs. In this case, they're clearly coordinating with the riot police. And what they do here is they're lining up with their back to the rows of the riot police. They get between the protesters, and so this picture, right, was before this. So they get here, so they separate everybody. They line these guys up in between, and then even with photographers, if there's any violence between these guys and the protesters, well, it's not uniformed officers, you know, nothing to do with it. So it allows the government this deniability. And I've never felt threatened in any of these protests at all, even like walking around like this until this particular day. And I'm like as close as Giannis is, you know, actually a little closer. with the camera. This is pre-cell phone, so I'm carrying an actual proper big camera, taking a bunch of pictures of these guys. And this guy was really not happy with me. And he stared at me for about 15, 20 minutes and followed me around. And I'd move out and come back, and I'd look over at him, and he never broke his gaze with me in the most threatening manner. And my heart was pounding because I never felt threatened. But this guy is a plainclothes guy who's really angry at me, and I don't know what he's going to do. Is he going to follow me or something? So I think one of the things this illustrates is, though, even in these routine moments where everything seems familiar and we know how it's going to go and everybody knows where to stand, there's always the possibility for things to change. There's always things that could go wrong, or the police could react differently. And this was a moment that this came out of nowhere, and then this became itself a routine thing. And then we get into the uprising period. It is these plainclothes loyalists, whether they're with the government or not, who do a lot of the violence in the protests more than the state actually does. So what are the political effects of routine protests? What kind of political work? I mentioned you can use them as photo ops, like the Muslim Brotherhood does, to signal commitment to your followers. Activists tell me they want to keep the protest spaces open. They're worried, since all these other places are being closed down and fenced off, they're like, if we behave and stick to the routine, we'll be able to continue protesting here. And the advantage of that is it also keeps the topic in public discourse, right? You keep it in discussion. The government can't say nobody's opposed to the peace treaty. But the next time there's an Israeli campaign into Gaza or some other atrocity, everyone will know where to go, right? People know this is the place to go to. Even if these protests mean nothing, when thousands turn out, and we saw this many times, most recently Sheikh Jarrah 2 years ago, thousands turned out to this site. And also, as well established in the literature and social movements literature, protests are places for learning, gaining information, for protesters as well as for the police. If the state sees 50 people show up week after week and suddenly it's 250 and then it's 1,000, that's important information. Likewise for the protesters, the plainclothes people show up, they're learning something. The government is kind of saying, watch yourself, or maybe we're not going to allow this anymore. So a lot of stuff can come out of protest, out of just whether you achieve the demand you're set out for. And this is the field that they used to gather, and now also has a fence around it. And this field is for rent. If you'd like to rent a rocky field, you can rent this one. I called this number twice to try to ask, and they kept hanging up on me. They're like, who is this crazy person who wants to know why the fence went up? So I will end there, and thank you so much for listening. I know I covered a lot of ground. I hope I didn't do it too quickly, because I also left a bunch of other stuff out. But I look forward to comments and comments from the floor and your comments. And also, I'm expanding part of this in a broader comparative article. So beyond questions you might have for me, I'd love to hear the kind of comments like, this made me think of, or this reminded me of some case that I know. Because I think as we think comparatively, that's where we're really going to learn more, rather than just a single case study, but really to try to think comparatively about these issues. So thank you very much.
I hope this is working. Yes, great. Well, first of all, thanks a lot, Jillian, for this very insightful presentation, and also for giving us all a glimpse into the book and the extensive research that you've been doing on Jordan, which you beautifully capture in this book, Protesting Jordan. As someone that is interested in how state-society relations are negotiated spatially, especially in times of contentious actions, I remember being extremely thrilled when your book came out, and it is really impressive how you succeeded in combining temporal but also spatial scales in your analysis, and how you constantly zoom in and out through the book, be it from the street to the city to the nation, but also from decades to months to even minutes. So I just want to thank you for that, and also for showing kind of how dissent and repression are in a constant process that is also expressed and shaped spatially. I'm gonna profit from my facilitation role and start with my questions first, and then later give you the floor. Maybe for the last part that you were presenting, I was wondering, so you were kind of showing how citizens or protesters are kind of making use of these routine protests, and I was wondering how the state is actually making use of these protests, especially because, and I found this very interesting that you were saying that the protests are not necessarily disruptive, but like have this routine character. And I was wondering, because as I said, this state-society relation, what is like the interest of the state then, or how does the state kind of profit from these routine protests?
Thank you. So a couple examples I mentioned, just to list off with the other ones I hadn't mentioned. One instance is to sort of show Washington, D.C. in particular, but the world, like how moderate it is, you know, to say, oh, we are not repressing violently, we're so moderate, we're becoming democratic, and it's not becoming democratic, it's becoming less democratic. But it allows it to sort of perform this moderation and how progressive and different it is from other states. And these are protests it doesn't want. I think all of, you know, I show that it's trying to sort of shut these down, but when they're there, they use them to that effect. I also show in the book, which I didn't mention here, ways in which they've used, on at least two occasions, the 2018 protests and one previously, to go to the International Monetary Fund and say, we have to renegotiate these lifting of subsidies because look how people are protesting. We can't have the state collapse, so you have to renegotiate with us. And so they've used it to that effect as well. They use it to gain information, you know, who's protesting, you know, what kinds of things they're willing to say, how contentious it gets. But I think another way it doesn't make use of, or well, it does kind of make use of it in these sort of the grievances that come from these areas. They use the protests to sort of find out, like, what do we need to give these areas to get them to calm down, to sort of continue to buy their support. So instead of having broad programs that actually serve everyone, it's like, okay, these people over here are contentious because, you know, they don't have running water, so I'm going to give them running water, but I hope nobody else notices. But I'm at least going to give you guys running water, and then you'll be quieted down. So I think they're kind of using it to kind of maintain that support base, but without actually broadly providing services to everyone in a meaningful way. And one of the things that's happened, you know, just like now, is there was a royal wedding last week, and everything got cleaned up and everything got fixed. And people are like, so you can actually do it when you want to do it. You can make things work when you want to do it. So, you know, it sort of, in a way, they want it to look great, but it kind of backfires because then it shows that they do have capacity when they have the will.
Thanks a lot for this. It's interesting how I feel like it's very different from other cases that I personally work on. Like there are similarities with like Egypt and Cairo, of course, like spatially speaking, but then also kind of I feel like it's a very different approach from the state side. But actually another thing that I wanted to ask is also beyond the state, maybe a little, if we can think about beyond the state. I know the book, of course, focuses on like state making, but you also very beautifully show, especially also in the last chapter, this regional and international entanglement. And I know we didn't have time in the presentation, but maybe you could share a bit more about that, and also kind of how the flows of people and the movements internationally and also economically speaking, how they kind of coin into this. Yeah.
Great, so I can give some examples. I will say there's so much more that could be developed in this regard. And so there's a lot in the last chapter that is illustrative, but outside of my expertise. So one example that I think is really important is Jordan has a counterterrorism training center. So, okay, during the uprisings, people would say protesters are learning from each other and states are learning from each other, which they are, but it's actually much worse or better or more literal than that. In places like this training center that Jordan runs, and it's not the only one, they're all over the planet. These are for-profit training centers. Jordan's, it's called CASODIC, it's the King Abdullah Special Center for Counterterrorism, something like this. Was built by the United States Department of Defense. It's run by retired military contractors, US contractors, but it's formally, the training is done by Jordanian forces, the armed forces and the gendarmerie, et cetera. Anyone can train there if you pay, and I mean anyone. I mean, we could train there if we had the money. You can go on the public-facing website, and it lists the courses you can take, and you fill out an application form, and then they'll begin negotiating with you how much it costs. And so you have state forces, non-state forces there. And the courses that are offered include things like crowd control, how to clear a public square, things that are actually about protest policing, their training. And so it's not simply that Egypt is learning from Jordan, it's that Egyptian troops are training with Jordanians about how to protest, how to police protests. That doesn't mean they're enacting them the same way. We know there's different levels of violence, but you have these kind of interactions around training, around who's going where. I showed you the Bahrain Pearl Roundabout. Jordanian gendarmerie forces went to Bahrain to help support Bahrain in that moment. In Jordan, people talk about that it was actually the Jordanian gendarmerie's idea to deconstruct the Pearl Roundabout, that it came from Jordanians. I don't know if that's true. I wasn't able to confirm it. But it's interesting that Jordanians think that the idea came from them, or from their police. So you have movement of people policing. So what happened in Bahrain wasn't just Bahraini troops. It was Gulf forces riding in on US military vehicles with Pakistani, military members of the Saudi army, and Jordanian and Syrian police there. All it came in, and so there's this back and forth. So it's not like what happened in Egypt and what happened in Tunisia. There's so much interconnection, and I say this is outside of my area of expertise. Like I acknowledge it's there and show that it's there, but I have colleagues that specialize in military forces and weaponry, and the expertise around that is more technical than I have. But I think I try to show enough that it's evidently there. And the second thing about the economic thing and the policing of places like that Abdali Boulevard mega project, why you can't have protests there, is because if you're trying to attract foreign investment, if I want you to invest in my country, I need to convince you it's really stable and your investment is safe. And so I think part of this is like ways in which they go to these, ways to say either our protests are policeful, they're never that threatening, don't worry. If we start shooting into crowds, that's going to scare off foreign investors as much as it's going to, upset Jordanians. And so I think there's ways in which there's constraints in multiple directions having to do with who's investing where, what kind of training, facilitating, interactions between security forces. I think there's all sort of interconnected. But that stability, stability, stability. Like you can't attract investment if you can't convince everyone it's really stable and will be into the future.
Great, thanks a lot. This is definitely a lot of food for thought. I have one last question that I want to ask before I open the floor. And it goes a bit into a different direction, but you showed this one picture of women being kind of like at the front of the demonstrations, and I was wondering if you also saw like its gender dimension, like spatially speaking, but also temporally, but I think spatially speaking would be something that I'm really interested in.
Yeah, definitely. So there's two things. One is the role of women in protests around any topic. And there's women at almost every protest. Sometimes there'll be no women. But most protests, there's some contingent of women. In protests like these, you see the women are mixing with the men throughout. It's just they come and go, and some are wearing headscarves and some aren't, and they're just part of that. In other one, and then the women, the strategy of women being up front, again, that's a global strategy. That's not a Jordan-specific strategy. But you also see, like when the Muslim Brotherhood has its protests, there's always women at the Muslim Brotherhood protests, but they have a cordoned off area for the women to gather. And then when they move through the march, they have this separate women's area that moves with the guards all the way around them. So they move as a block. So they're separate. So like you can protest and be great and be badass, but we're still going to protect you. You still need a protection. And we see this as well. There was one in 2010, which I talk about in the book, this sort of, these day wage laborers that want to have permanent jobs, and they're advocating for permanent jobs, mostly in agriculture, but not entirely. And some of the women activists are like, we're not getting anywhere, we need to up our contention. So they come up with the idea to go to downtown Amman and have an overnight protest, an overnight sit-in. And they do, and the women actually outnumber the men. There's about 40 women and about 30 men in this protest, and they're down there protesting, and after a couple hours, we don't know who, I couldn't confirm who, somebody brings out tents, and they set up tents for the women to be sheltered overnight. So think of that, like you can protest and be a woman, but we're still gonna make sure you're sheltered and safe. And so you find that kind of like enactment of patriarchy, and you're still in need of protection, even if you're out there being contentious. So I'm thinking about these things comparatively, and I haven't written this yet, but there's fascinating protests in Mexico City around the femicide and control of public space, and there was a monument that had Christopher Columbus on it, and they took Christopher Columbus down, and then the female protesters at some point put on this woman holding her arm up, and then after some period, then a more permanent one of this woman holding her arm up, and then the police blocked off that with the fence, and then the women wrote the names of all the women who had died all over the fence. And so there's this like, back and forth of what's happening with this space. And then that came down, and now they're going to put up a statue of an indigenous woman, but there's contention about like who's doing the statue of the indigenous woman. So I'm collecting in a file stuff that I want to think through these gendered issues, and also collecting things from like feminist geography and critical women's studies and things like this to think about, but it's really preliminary. But I think there's super interesting gender dynamics worth exploring that I haven't been taught, in the social movement literature I don't think has done justice to the spatial aspect of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel the same, but it's interesting to know to hear that you've noticed also kind of these dialectical processes, be it in the perspective in regard to like gender dynamics, but also spatial and temporally. Okay, so now I am opening the floor. Please, if you have questions or comments, raise your hand visibly, and then Yanis would give you the mic so you can ask your question. I can see one question there. Maybe let's take like 2 questions at a time, and then let Jillian answer.
Thank you. Jillian, thank you so much. I just want to say I've had the honor of writing about this book, and I'm just so overwhelmed actually seeing all the images, and it sort of gives even more flavor, and I think you should do something with all these. I see them in some beautiful like artistic project. I don't know, we can do something with it. Something should be done with all of this. When you were talking,
can you turn on the mic? I think
it is on.
Is it? A bit closer then.
Okay, like this? Sorry. Okay, so when you were speaking, obviously, my mind went to the parts about, sort of regional cooperation and sort of the comparative aspect that you're interested in. And of course, I thought of the Gulf and Israel, right? And sort of their relationship with Jordan, and which you speak about and which you also mentioned here. But then I thought, it's true, why not go beyond that? Like in many ways, sort of in our area studies, we focus on the post-colonial states like Jordan, but actually I want to mention a case that might be of interest to you. So in Germany, I don't know if you know, but they've banned the Nakba Day protests in Germany recently, in Berlin specifically. And some of what you discuss about how to control public space and of course how to control language and speech, you saw at play in the German state here. It was very surprising, actually, how they maneuvered around the people. So one of the things, first there was a blanket kind of censorship and silencing and ban of the demonstrations. I remember a few weeks later, after the decision of the ban came out, I was walking in Potsdamer Platz, a place where these demos don't usually take place, okay, on Nakba Day or the Palestine-related ones. And I was with my partner, and we saw like around 5 or 6, maybe 10 men, okay, holding up the Palestinian flag, right, singing Palestinian songs. And it was when we asked, we said, what is this? There was no announcement for it. I knew nobody of the organizers, people I've never seen before in my life. And they said, some of the people that were watching, that were part of it, said, we don't know who the organizers were or are. And of course that shocked us because, it was supposed to be, and it's such a public display. And I realized actually it was very much a sign of weakness, right? Because when you see 5, or 10 men protesting Israeli, basically political prisoners in Palestine. This was what the protest was about. You realize this is the state's way of also saying, look, we allow the protest to take place, but you know that's not going to bring any sort of effective change. So it would be interesting to think about how these states that we assume, you know, are liberal democracies, who actually teach countries like Jordan, like Germany's done so much development work in Jordan, democracy, rule of law, all that kind of work that it's done in Jordan, how it then, you know, or not how it doesn't apply a lot of what it teaches. And I thought, yeah, my mind for the first time actually went in this direction. I thought, what happens when we do these comparative studies, you know? So just maybe food for thought for your sort of, yeah, research for the future in this direction.
No, thank you so much, Nan. Yeah, absolutely. I've been in Germany all week. This is my 4th talk, and I've been scribbling stuff about, walking over with Giannis, even we're talking about it. So I'm definitely pursuing it, but this goes back to something you mentioned about comparisons, is I love these kinds of comparisons, and it's not to say everything's like Jordan or everything's not like Jordan, but it's sort of like, what are the threads that line up that are similar, and where are they different? And I think when we accumulate a larger mass rather than one country, a larger critical mass of people that have in-depth knowledge, not just me reading newspapers for a week, but have larger in-depth knowledge, I think we're really going to come up with some exciting new things, well beyond what this does, but because it will just have more information. So thank you, and I've been fascinated this week about it. So thank you.
Thank you. It's a very interesting topic, and thank you for the presentation. I was just, one of the questions that I had is, you know, when you were presenting, I couldn't stop but think about how there was this, Mexican ruler in the 18th and 20th century, and he wanted to build like a national identity through big like modernization. And there was this Great Canal was the name, and you know, it was, the thing is that it got promoted at the international scale, and it was to build like a national identity for foreigners, but also for the government itself. You can see how high-level public servants have also appropriated like the speech of how Mexico is going to be now, from now on. So in that sense, I was wondering about how, you know, these projects for foreign looks builds national identity, but I couldn't help but also think, so in that sense, how in Jordan, you've talked a little bit of how, you know, they try to portray an image for investments, for foreign investments, but I also wanted to think of how people that protest are starting to have the national identity being shaped by routinary protests, no? And how do they understand Jordan itself? Yep.
Thank you. It's actually an important part of the book that I didn't talk about a whole lot is, the book's called Protesting Jordan, which has 2 meanings. One is Jordanians are protesting a lot. But the other is protesting about, like, what is Jordan? Like, who are we as Jordanians? And you have this conventional narrative that you have the real Jordanians and then Palestinians that come, and that's the divide and the real, et cetera. And it's much more complicated than that. And just one of the complications, of many, but one of the complications is among those original, north-south corridor areas that I talked about, are people who in protests are expressing the view that real Jordanians were there before the Great Arab Revolt, right? Before World War I. Those are real Jordanians. That excludes the monarchy. The monarchy was not there until after World War I. So it's incredibly contentious, and I showed tons and tons of slogans and chants from protests that are about identity, about the real Jordanians are not the monarchy, and the monarchy's an interloper that we might let stay, or we might not. Or maybe this is the last king, or maybe the king's brother might be a better idea, or maybe the king needs to go because he's not Jordanian. So in the protest, you're seeing expressions, and this is what the temporality comes in, the sort of invoking who the real Jordanians is in a time period, says you're an interloper, i.e. you're not going to be here forever. The real Jordanians are going to be here forever. And the Palestinians are going home eventually because they're not Jordanian either. So you're finding these kinds of like visions of the past and visions of the future articulated really clearly in protests that are very much about national identity, the who we are, who is Jordanian. So yeah, thank you very much for that. And listen, every time I talk to someone who brings up the case of Mexico, I'm like, I need to learn more and more about this. So it just seems like a great leverage comparison. So thank you. This one here?
I think, yeah.
Behind the pole.
Yeah, also thank you for preparing the presentation and showing us the images. One of the images that strike me as starkly similar to the situation that I experienced in Vietnam is the images with the thugs. The Batagia, I don't know if Yeah. And do you think it's also, like, do you fear it could be also a sort of government control exercise? Because, you know, for example, in Vietnam, there are cases where the government also kind of like put the plainclothes agents into the protests to try to like excite it up. So they try to incite violence for a probable cause to stomp down on the protest itself. Do you fear it might be the case also in Jordan, or do you think the Jordan government have other plans?
So a number of activists have told me they're familiar with who comes out, and sometimes there'll people that'll be out there and they're concerned that this person is going to like damage property or something, and they'll literally buzz like, we don't know who this person is, we don't know who this crowd is, and they seem all not average people joining us, but they seem organized, and they're really concerned that they're plants to create damage, to create justifications for going in and repressing. And so most likely, that has happened in some instances. I think another interesting dimension, and I'm now going to read into Vietnam, but is this use of these sort of thugs or right-wing, whatever you want to call it, because we were talking in recent years in the United States, that the United States has the Beltaguilla problem. We have the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers and all these like right-wing people that show up at protests that the police sort of stand off and don't really intervene with and let them go forth and do it. And we saw this in Portland with the George Floyd protest. They're driving around in vans threatening to kidnap people, and the police aren't doing anything about these guys that are, threatening to kidnap activists and protesters. So I sadly think this is like happening in a lot of places, but I think that could be, like that particular topic could be fascinating for a broad comparative study if, somebody's looking for a topic. I think it would be, I think you find that in a lot of places. And the dynamics of what the police are willing to repress or not, who they tolerate. Kyle Rittenhouse in the United States can shoot a live gun into a crowd and get off free, and yet other people, walking through the neighborhood while you're black and someone shoots you, that's okay. So we have I think we're seeing dimensions of that everywhere. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this inspirational talk. I had 3 points. One is the issue of Baltageya, and I just wanted to ask you if this is a Jordanian expression, or did it come up because sometimes people told me it's very Egyptian, and it came up through the discourse on the Egyptian revolution, and it's thus that other Arab people, activists, got to know what Baltageya even is.
It's exactly that. The time that this time, they did not call them Beltageya. They do now.
Yeah.
So somewhere between there, and they're now called Beltageya,
so now
but
there's a
in
name.
2009, nobody called them that. Yeah.
Okay.
So I assume it came from Egypt.
It's a mukhbir, or what? Is it like an informant or something like?
A thug that's a pro-regime thug. Yeah. It could be off-duty policemen. Like people saying, these have to be off-duty policemen because look at their haircuts. Nobody cuts their hair like that.
Yeah.
And they came in government vehicles. But in other times, there are just loyalists.
Yeah.
We have Trump loyalists that will come out and create violence, and they're not, so we don't necessarily know, and likely a combination.
Yeah. My other point is about everything taking place outside of Amman, because I think in the first wave of protests and revolutions in 10/11, we also learned that sometimes very meaningful protests start outside the capital. And so I'm just wondering how you look at these interaction between outside, inside, also if there is a lot of connectivity between possible activists or shared points, and so like, okay, these are shared concerns in the sense of coalition building.
Right.
And my third question or point is about the atmosphere. So I'm into affect and emotion a bit, and so I wonder, so how, I assume that this point of this is a routine protest is very much about the atmosphere of the thing, right? How you feel, and that it somehow feels strangely safe. And so I'm just wondering how your thoughts are about that.
Great. So the chapter 5, which is the one about routine protest, is framed around affect theory. And so I look, it's as sort of part of the ethnography is showing up hours before and paying attention to, like, not just what's happening during the protest, but are shopkeepers closing? Are pedestrians concerned? I mean, if there's 18 armored vehicles on your block and you're just walking to the store, does that concern you or not? You know, so I frame that whole chapter around affect theory, which I think is super important. On the outside, I mean, I spend a lot of time outside of Amman. The only one I really talked about today was the marchers from the south coming to the capital, but it is a pet peeve of mine that how to say carefully, many people working on politics in Jordan focus on formal institutions and never leave West Amman, or write about things and never leave West Amman. And like, that's just like a fraction of the city, let alone the country. And so I spent a lot of time outside. I only was able to get to a couple protests outside, but that had to do with logistics or not being in the country or various things. But I really do spend a lot of time looking at those dynamics. And so I did talk about the sort of emergence of a new routine of marching to the Capitol to take your grievances to the Capitol, which wasn't a common thing in the 2000s, that now had become a much more common thing. And on cooperation, I mean, you have more connected activist networks for people in the north that are within an hour and a half of the Capitol. So those activists know each other more than like to go to Amman in the south, even though some of them do know each other. But they're not likely to have as close connections as those who are running into each other in and around the capital. Because the ones in Amman can get to Tafila if they want to get to Tafila, but it's going to take a little longer than if they want to get to Madaba, which is, you know, much shorter trip to get there. So, and the government, I also showed the government tries to stop a lot of the Amani activists from getting there, either arresting them or just stopping them on the road and sending them back, because they don't want all those connections to be robust. So thank you.
Well, Jill, thanks very much. Actually, I'm so happy that I got you here. Also, it seems like a pun, but clearly the pictures, your own, you know, in this case, illustrate, make the points. And I mean, I had like just a point and two, but actually you just answered one of my questions, was like how much this is also relevant outside Amman, and you just said, because this is an issue for, I mean, many, and again, not only, but especially in the region too, because also somehow, you know, taking the representation of elite of people that we talk to everything is really into the capital of, or maximum second thing. Also, since you say, yes, I mean, especially one slide, and the point about the significance of non-contentious protests. I mean, this is very relevant to me, and also helped me to shed light in retrospect and in comparison, not only to, for instance, Cairo, Tunis, even most recently that I went to Baghdad. I mean, there was like the ongoing non-contentious protests in Tahrir Square, but the meaning, it was exactly, you know, all the things that you said, including keeping the topic high and also keeping a place that, you know, should not be completely neutralized by the government and other things. And I have also one question that maybe goes a little bit beyond, so, but feel free. because of, not, I don't say lack of coverage, but less coverage of Jordan, in spite of being considered one of the few oases of stability. And as a side effect, speaking as a colleague, now there are more students going there and like only myself, I marked 3 PhD on Jordanian politics, Italian PhDs in the last 3 years, and I didn't see anyone before. So I mean, this is sort of a side effect. So to what extent these represent self and also general representation of stability correspond or contrast with some of the plural realities on the ground that your deep and also, let's say, ongoing observation can tell us? I mean, in terms of this idea of stability with, clearly there is more than reality. I mean, so in terms of what is the situation?
In terms of, is it stable?
Yes. In terms, it's big. In terms also, let's put it this way, to what extent your super extensive work on protest can tell us about that? After a few questions, I thought I could ask, but I waited.
The impossible question. I will say just on the first part about, something else to say about outside of Amman, one of the things that comes up in this long view is that outside Amman you see some of the repertoires that go back, like I said, sometimes 150 years, still happening. Blocking roads, burning police buildings. That doesn't mean you don't see it in Amman, but you don't see it in the same kind of way. It's not a go-to repertoire the way it is in those other places where you're very quick to block roads. And then, the government creates new roads with new overpasses that make it harder to block roads. So there's all that kind of, cat and mouse thing as well. So on the impossible question, I don't know. So I don't know. I think if the regime falls in 10 years, you could read my book and go like, oh my God, it's obviously going in that trajectory. And if it doesn't, you can read my book and go, look at the way it's managed all of these decades and all this contention. It somehow manages it. I will say I was there last summer, and there was a lot more pessimism among people, not everybody, but there were people that said something's different, economically it can't survive. But we've been saying economically it can't survive for 30 years, but something's different. The desperate attempt to shut everything down is escalated. The number of people in prison has escalated. The government now has this new plan where there's going to be 3 political parties basically created by the Mukhabarat, and you can go join one of them, and what is that? So I don't, but I honestly don't know, For definitely some there's obviously a division among activists about that, as there are anywhere. Do you use violence? Do you not? Whatever. One of them that I cite extensively in there is Hisham Bustani, who is an activist. He's very well known. He's an activist, and he said to me last summer, he's like, "We've accomplished nothing. Yes, we have, we can get people out this anti-austerity protest, and yes, it changes slightly, but this is plowing ahead. We're not accomplishing anything. The only protests that are accomplishing things are these small protests that are like, we want water, we want a cell phone tower, we want jobs, and they're accomplishing things, but they're small and transactional. There's nothing big and structural and systemic that's really changing. And so some of them, like him, are being frustrated considering leaving these kinds of issues. And others are, like some of the ones I said, they're like, we got to keep at it because a moment will come. And when the moment comes, we have to be there ready for, to have something that can pick up momentum that people can get onto to push things forward. And maybe that will happen. Something someone else said to me, a Jordanian recently, and this had to do with the Trump period with Kushner and MBS and all of that, when Jordan was being sidelined, and said to me, look, everybody says the US will never abandon Jordan because of Israel, right? They're never going to, and Jordan's in terrible shape without U.S. financial assistance. And there's Saudi's financial assistance, but a lot of that money never actually comes through. There's a lot promised, but so it's really U.S. financial assistance. And everybody says the U.S. won't abandon Jordan because they can't, because it's too important to Israel. And it'll just never happen. And he said to me, everybody thought the U.S. would never abandon the Shah. And then they did. Like, if they decide they don't need us and they can go around another way, you know, if the Gulf states are going to make peace with Israel, then Jordan's not really important anymore. And, like, that could happen. And I thought that was really an interesting insight, or interesting comment. But I don't know. But I think you can lay out the possibilities in different directions, you know. It's not a satisfying answer. But.
Yeah. Yeah, also one thought I had is the decoupling you mentioned between being a democratic versus authoritarian country and allowing protest goes in both ways. So on the one hand, we have authoritarian countries allowing protests, and then we also have democratic countries repressing protests. So I think it would also be interesting in the future to see how democratic countries deal with protests, and also what symbolic meaning they attach to allowing protests or disallowing protests.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's really one of the areas that I touch on in the book, but I really think is worth pushing forward, but is getting beyond the protest and policing in democracies is somehow completely different than protest and policing in authoritarian cases. Because, as you're saying, we're seeing the backsliding and crushing of protests, and we're talking on the way over here about, you know, some of the ways in which protests aren't allowed in the same kind of way here, and vary, of course, by state, that it's changing. And I think we're seeing that in a lot of places. And I think that's a really fruitful area, I think, for comparative research. So thank you, yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. And my question goes in a bit of a different direction after the big question that was asked. I also really enjoyed reading your chapter about the Kaluti mosque routine, and I thought it really made clear this larger idea in the book about the repertoires and the patterns, and then how the breaks in the patterns are what's interesting. And so I was wondering, on a methodological level, whether you could reflect on your role in this routine as a participant observer, sort of whether you felt at certain points whether you were also an actor in this play and how that played out.
Yeah, so I mean, I did participate in a lot of protests, not chanting, but being in the middle of the protest, particularly around the question of affect. Like, I want to be in the middle of the crowd to feel how things are going, and, you know, feel if it's changing or not. You know, Jordan has a diverse range of looks. You know, I'm not Jordanian, but in some crowds, I'm not as big a standout as you might think. You know, so sometimes my positionality is clear. You know, I'll go to a protest and, like, all the reporters and all the mukhabarat come in, they're filming me, and the reporters want to know who I am, and it's clearly I'm other, right? And then in other ones, like the Kaludi ones, people don't really pay any attention to me at all. That might be partly because I've been to so many, they're kind of familiar with me, and certainly the police know who I am. I mean, we know that's the case. So that's one way. The other is just the sort of positionality is I'm able to access a wider range of people. I've had friends, a female Jordanian journalist who told me, like, half the people you talk to would never talk to me. Like, if I called and asked these questions, they would never talk to me. And so I get that. And yet there's others that are doing phenomenal work. Hanan Tukan, but like Heber, one of the best news sites, is run by a woman, has female journalists, and they get out there and do stuff. And so there is, you know, a lot that do it. But I do think about, you know, I do try to reflect on that. And it's, you know, in some places in the book where I mention my being there when I think it is relevant. But thank you. But I think that's, like, we all need to think about that all the time in all our research. Even don't assume there's one position. It's going to change by context. But thank you, and thank you for reading it.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jillian. That was really inspiring. And I think the fascinating thing about the book and the talk is that everyone can find something to connect to, right? Because it's, yeah. And I mean, I'm not working on protest generally. I look at them when they come my way, but I don't go looking for them. But what I do work on is knowledge politics. And the last point you made, basically, like people go to these protests to gather information. I was wondering whether you could talk a bit more about the knowledge flows and whether they are also channeled, confined by the built environment, and how, and whether you can give us some examples.
Can you say more about what you mean by knowledge flows?
I mean, the knowledge that people want to gather, that must come from somewhere, right? And that must go somewhere. And so I was wondering, is that a particular kind of knowledge that is produced at this place? Or is that some people come from somewhere, go to this place, and then there's some kind of exchange? Are there certain narratives being shaped there?
Yeah.
And is that also somehow shaped by built environment, infrastructure, people, and how? And is there an example?
Okay. I'll have to think about if it's connected to the built environment, because that's a fascinating question and is likely to be great, and I just don't have much thoughts on it.
Maybe are there questions like from the back, so we can also spatially move the microphone? I see there is one there, so we can take yours first, and then maybe Anna's.
Yeah, I also, sorry, want to thank you very much. First, I had a very maybe basic question. Do these protests need to be approved by the Interior Ministry or police? And you also mentioned that there are more prisoners these days, so do they get harassed afterwards, and under which circumstances do you think there's more harassment from the judiciary? And also one observation that I found very interesting, that you mentioned that because the regime or the king draws legitimacy from the periphery, that they are very sensitive towards grievances there, because when I, for example, think of Iran, the regime doesn't really care about the grievances in the periphery, because they also don't draw legitimacy from the ethnic or religious minorities from there. So that's also what I found really interesting, because when I look at the Iran protests, I always think the periphery is for the regime not important, but now I thought, yeah, it's also, it can be totally different.
Great, yeah. So on that last comment is fantastic, and it's one of the things I'm hoping people think about comparatively, because people will say, well, Jordan's a special case because you have the East Bankers and the Palestinian majority, and that it is a special case. But I mean, every country is a special case, and I think the way to ask the question is the way you're asking it, to say, is there a portion of the population that the government's more willing to ignore than other portions where it can't ignore as much, or it isn't willing? And it could be they're central, could be they're peripherally located, or could be what. But that's a comparative question that I think would be fantastic to sort of pull out. The permit system, it's to the municipality, but it's changed wildly over the years. And this was this comment I started out with about asking about the public gathering law and whether you need a permit or not. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you need to notify them, but you don't have to get permission. Sometimes you need permission. The takeaway isn't about the specifics of how that's changed over time, but that some groups, like the Muslim Brotherhood, always want to make sure the government knows what they're going to do and that they're okay with it. And when I was doing my early work on the Muslim Brotherhood, I was in the office with Hamza Mansour, who is the Secretary General of the Islamic Action Front, and we paused a conversation so he could take a call because they were talking with someone in the municipality about an upcoming protest. And they hadn't, at that point you had to submit a permit. But they weren't even submitting a permit until they already negotiated and it was okay what they were going to do. And then they would submit the formal permit, but they talked about it ahead of time. Whereas like the leftist activists are like, we don't get permits, we don't care. But even if they don't get permits, sometimes they try to get permits and it gets turned down. Sometimes they, which, there's certain ones, so sometimes they do try to get permits, but in other times they don't care. But if they don't care, they still try to conform to what the acceptable spaces and patterns of protest. So we won't get a permit to go to the Kaludi Mosque, but we're going to act the way the government expects us to act. So I mean, you have a whole range of that. On arrests, I have found no documentation for anyone getting arrested for violating a public gathering law. They get arrested for everything else. From breaking property to criticizing the king to violating social distancing during coronavirus. the arrest of protesters, the harassment of protesters is less about arresting them in protest. It's more about destroying their lives in a variety of ways, destroying their businesses, threatening them, like no one in your family is going to get into college if you don't stop protesting. Like, can you really bear that burden that no one in your extended family is going to get accepted to college? You know, so all these kinds of issues. Lots of phone calls by the mukhabarat, lots of invitations to come in for tea and harassment and, you know, all of these kinds of things. But the worst violence against protesters in detention happens in police stations. It doesn't happen if you end up in prison or formally charged with things. It's the first police that pick you up and throw you in the van. If something is going to go wrong, it tends to be then. So, but you have a range, yeah. That's in chapter 7.
Thank you so much. It was really so clear and so precise, and I can also say that I could also relate with things that I know, like those, I don't know, our university is maybe not in a desert, but it's like in Dallendorf. So, you know, and here also at Koti with the Kotiwache, these types of repression techniques that I could recognize, and yeah, I think your book has a great impact. And regarding the front page of your book, I was just asking myself maybe what's the role of art also in this routine protests. So yeah.
So yeah, it's less than in some other places, but you do see a lot of there's multiple artists that write and draw work about it. One of the things I've seen is, especially in recent years, are efforts to do contentious things that are creative that the government kind of doesn't know what to do with yet. So in 1999, we had the Battle of Seattle, the World Justice Protest in Seattle, Washington, and one of the things the protesters did was they organized way, way, way in advance, and it was tons of groups, but like for the environmental protesters, they came dressed as like sea turtles and penguins and playful things that make it hard for the police to like repress people dressed as sea turtles. And so a couple of the things that have happened in recent years, this was before the pandemic, but Jordan signed a gas deal with Israel to buy gas from Israel. And so there's this campaign against that. And they've had some routine protests, and they've had some protests that have been shut down. And they had a mock trial. And the mock trial put the gas deal on trial for treason, found it guilty, executed it, put it in a coffin, and paraded it around Amman. And they were trying to come up with something that was like creative and artistic, but that would befuddle the government, that they wouldn't quite know what to do, because someone's carrying a coffin, like, we don't think it's a funeral, but we don't really know what's in it. And they got away with it. And so they're trying to think of these more creative, artistic ways of incorporating things in protest to buy them additional space or less repression. In terms of art, you don't see, like you do in Cairo, those sort of gorgeous murals. You just don't see that. But there is an active graffiti scene. Anthropologist Kyle Craig is doing his dissertation on it right now, which is absolutely fantastic. But there's a difference between sort of independent artists doing work on their own, some of which is political, and a lot of which is funded by international NGOs and international governments that are gorgeous murals, but they're not particularly political, except it might have a gender statement to it. So you have that happening, but it's less. I talk about it in chapter 7, but it's, again, citing his work and citing others' work that are more in depth on that. And he follows that scene and who's doing what, and very, very carefully. So that'll be work to look out for.
Maybe just because we have 5 minutes left, can you just show me if any questions are left? I know Yanis has one. Okay, so maybe we can just take the 3 questions after each other, and then Jillian can answer them, just to save a bit of time.
So I take the opportunity before the time's over to quickly comment on it myself. Like, as you know, I'm very fascinated by the book, and I can't help but find these comparisons to Egypt all the time, where as you know, I've worked on the Rabaa massacre and the Muslim Brotherhood's mobilization after it, and from how the Rabaa Square has been remodeled, reshaped, and architecturally redesigned to the new capital that is now being built in the desert, and the way how it's being built as a fortress, basically not with walls, but in the desert somewhere, completely insulated from where you could protest, basically, or people that could protest. To the fact that this city is built so wide that even if you have space, you can't even fill it, so it's not disruptive at all if you had it. But aside from these, comparisons, I work with event data, and I know you stress over and over again that you're not like seeing no value in it. However, I would like to, risking that this is a boring methodological question towards the end, I'm sure you've thought of ways of how potentially event data could be integrated with or profit from a different spatial perspective, or how could spatial data be somehow, be scraped and cataloged in a different way to make sense of these disruptive dynamics beyond just categories of size and frequency, basically.
Thank you very much for your talk. My question would be, how do you approach these protests as a researcher, particularly because there might be multiple reasons and objectives and dreams which lead people to join these protests? So how do you do justice to these sort of multiple meanings of one and the same gathering? And in relation to that, I was wondering whether you could elaborate a bit on the potential of the comparative frame, because the comparative frame would have to fix something, I guess, that could then be compared. So how could that approach do justice to the sort of ambiguities and also changes of meaning over time? Thank you.
I'm not going too methodological, but because you did mention different ways in which the government reacted to protests like erasure, enclosure, etc. And I think, what is also interesting for me is, does the emergence of social media might also be a new dimension to overcome it, also for the government to use more of the containment?
Okay, fantastic. So I'll start with the last one. So social media the use of the internet for protests in Jordan goes actually back to the 90s. There was Marwan Washer was the Minister of Information and created this Ask the Government online, where your question went live and you could see everybody's questions, and then he would answer them. And there was a protest in 1997 that people were calling each other and just posting what was happening, not asking the government anything, just posting information, and other people were monitoring it and conveying it to people. Since the social media revolution, particularly since smartphones, the biggest impact, I think, has to do with filming of protests and uploading those, rather than like it being a way to communicate. It is a way to communicate, but the government is monitoring everything. It's not anonymous. And in Egypt has, bigger than Jordan, like a whole agency that does nothing but monitor social media and track things. And so it's not a safe space in any kind of way. I talk about it in chapter 7 and only a few pages of it, in part because as I started to dive into it, and I think it's really important, and it's missing that I don't do more with it, but as I started to dive into it, I had such confidence in my knowledge about the stuff I talk about, and I realized I would be scratching the surface, and it's a whole project unto itself that I would love someone to do. But also diving into theory, I know you're not mentioning theory, but there are very well-developed theories of cyberspace and multiple spaces and digital eversion that exist across multiple fields, and I was like, I'm just out of my depth here. And I don't want to do this really rich analysis and then just like look like an idiot because I don't know what I'm talking about. The same thing with the security military stuff. It's just not my area of expertise. So I flag it. I think it's important. There's really interesting, I talk about, I would love someone to do this. People will post manifestos on behalf of like the Sons of the Beni Sachar, and they'll post this manifesto, And then somebody else will say, well, no, we're the sons of the Beni Sachar. Who's this person posting, speaking on behalf of all of us? We disagree with this. Like, I think that's a fascinating, area that somebody could do a dissertation on. But I just scratched the surface of it. But I'm not because I don't think it's important, but just because I felt suddenly out of my depth. But it's on my things to consider for sure. How to do comparison. So I think there's two ways to think about it. One is for someone, so I have a colleague, we mentioned Iran, a colleague of mine, I was talking to him about this, and he said, Iranians protest all the time. All the time. Like, it's just routine, and there's different spaces, but nobody writes about it, much like in Jordan, no one writes about it. We only hear the big ones. We know the women protesting now. We hear the Green Revolution. So one point of comparison would be someone who knows a country with incredible detail, like I know Jordan, to write in dialogue with me what they're seeing in their case, in absolute, depth and a long arm, and not a paired comparison, but inspired by the ideas to say, well, what do we see in Iran that's similar and different, and let's talk about Iran, Mexico, and Guatemala, and whatever. The second way, which is something I'm doing, which is not to aim to be so deep, but to say, like, what are the ways in which spatial configurations shape protests? And so, like, I could talk about Germany, not knowing in-depth knowledge about Germany, but I could still say there's a series of protests that take place in these spaces that tend to have these dynamics that are similar to what I'm seeing in other places. And that's kind of the comparison I'm looking to broaden out, not to claim I have anything close to 1% of the knowledge that I have in Jordan for other cases, but to say I'm looking narrowly at erecting fences, at blocking roads as a protest repertoire, something more narrow, and then not claiming that it has that kind of depth, but claiming to look at more particular techniques. So I think, like, thinking about the trade-offs of that, like, which am I doing in my comparison, that there's not one answer, but what am I aiming to do, I think is hopeful. And then on the methods question, again, I am not against the large events data. So I have my own data set, which is hand-coded, and it has thousands of protests in it. And then when we got to March of 2011, I had to stop because I'm like, I need an army of students to code all this stuff. And this is only the stuff in the Arabic language, let alone what all my other friends are telling me. So there's two things. One, there is an effort right now. There's a number of us that have worked on events data and protest events in Jordan are compiling a single data set which will become public when it's compiled and cleaned in Arabic sources. So there will be something people can do something with. What I was trying to do in mine was to, and again, the data is really partial, but to pay attention to the different policing agencies that show up. Like, is it different if the gendarmerie shows? The gendarmerie doesn't even appear until 2008. Do policing of protests change? Do spatial protest techniques change? After they're trained in these things, do things change? So I wanted that kind of fine-grained information. Did they march from here to here? Where did they encounter repression? So theoretically, you could add all that, but that stuff's never recorded in written newspaper articles in the kind of depth I want. So I'm too spotty and like, I know this protest I gave you in incredible detail because I've been there start to finish to a bunch of them. The other ones, I'm only going on what I can reconstruct. And one of the ways I try to reconstruct them is I get activists to take me physically to the site and talk me through what happened, because then they start to go, actually, no, they came from this way. And so you start to get things that way, but that's still their memory of it. And so the kinds of stuff I want to see would be hard to get there. Having said that, I think we can think about spatial dynamics, even if it's, marches and things, and you could see patterns of repression around those kinds of things could be very interesting over time. And the other thing we talked about with our collective events dream was using ArcGIS and mapping protests in a moving map over time, that you could see things come and go and move and police come and go and move. And that's completely doable. You need to have the data set to start with it and then and the money and someone who can build the thing. But I think something like that could be fascinating, and it's happening elsewhere. So you know, in 5 years, there could be an easy template that I just have to plug the data in instead of building it ourselves. But I think there's like a lot of possibilities with those that could be super, super interesting, but I don't have the money or the expertise to do them right now, but I'm excited about them, so.
Well, thanks a lot.
Thank
I'll
you
definitely
so
get
much.
some inspiration also from the methodological part for my own work. Thank you for being us and presenting your book, Protesting Jordan, Geographies of Power and Dissent. I would also like to thank the audience for so many engaging questions. I think we touched upon much more than just temporality in space, but also went into art and methodology, knowledge politics, the question of stability, which always is with us. Yeah, as Yannis said, this is part of a series that we at Interact organize, so check us out online, Twitter, etc. And feel free to join us again for future events. For now, if you would like to continue the conversation, Jillian is going to stay with us a bit more, and there is a bar right outside, so feel free to join us, have a drink, and also purchase the book if you would like. And yeah, many thanks for being with us today, and enjoy the rest of the evening.